It should have been the happiest day of my life, sun shining. Boxes loaded, dreams finally taking shape. But instead it turned into the most humiliating and infuriating experience I'd ever had. Her HOA title gave her the power to rule over everything and everyone in sight. I wasn't a thief, I wasn't trespassing, and I certainly wasn't some scammer looking to break into someone else's property. I was moving into my own ranch. One I had worked years to afford, with sweat, sacrifice, and late nights spent saving every dime I could. But none of that mattered when Karen saw me unloading furniture and decided I didn't belong. She didn't ask questions. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't even wait long enough for me to finish parking the moving truck. Instead, she stormed out of her pristine white farmhouse across the street, phone already clutched in one hand, the other raised like she was directing traffic. "Excuse me?" she shouted, marching across the gravel road with such entitlement you'd think she owned the whole county. "What do you think you're doing?" I stepped down from the back of the truck, sweat on my brow, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, and I remember blinking in confusion. "Moving in?" I said simply. She scoffed, looked me up and down like I was dirt on her porch, and said, "No, you're not. This property is private. I'm calling the police." I tried explaining. I showed her the deed. Told her my name, Tyler Prescotton, that I had purchased the ranch 2 months ago through a private sale with the former owners, the Callaways. But she didn't listen. Her eyes narrowed, her nostrils flared, and with one quick swipe, she was already reporting a suspicious man attempting to break into a home he doesn't own. That was the moment I knew exactly what kind of nightmare I was about to face. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-declared queen of the local HOA, an organization I hadn't even known existed when I bought the property. Turns out, the ranch technically fell within the outer limits of the Millstone Grove development, a community governed by rules, regulations, and people like Karen who took her clipboard and walkie-talkie more seriously than any elected official. I tried calling my realtor, but it was a Sunday. I tried reaching the county office to confirm the property records, but they were closed. And while I scrambled to prove what I already knew, that I legally owned the ranch, Karen stood on the edge of my driveway like a sentry, waving down neighbors, whispering lies, and whipping the community into a frenzy before the cops even arrived. And when the sirens came, oh, she stood proud. Hands on hips, victorious. The sheriff's deputy pulled up with lights flashing, and I felt a pit form in my stomach. 2 officers stepped out, already cautious, as Karen strutted forward, like she had summoned them from heaven. "That's him," she said, pointing directly at me. "He's been here all morning, trespassing, loading boxes, trying to change the locks." One of the officers approached me while the other stayed with Karen. I calmly explained everything. Again, how I had the deed, how the Callaways sold me the property directly, how the keys had been handed to me just that Friday. The officer asked for proof. So I pulled out the folder I had kept on hand. Thank God I had thought to bring it and handed him the signed contract. The notary seal, the property deed, and the check receipt. Walked back to his squad car. Made a call, and for 10 long minutes I stood there being watched, judged, treated like a criminal for daring to move into a home I bought with my own money. Finally, the officer came back and nodded. "Everything checks out, Mr. Prescott. Sorry about the confusion." Karen's face fell like a house of cards in the wind. But did she apologize? Of course not. She folded her arms, narrowed her eyes, and muttered, "You should have registered with the HOA. We don't allow unsupervised moves around here." That was my first clue that this wasn't going to be over just because the cops left. Karen wasn't satisfied with being wrong. She wanted control. And when she couldn't get it through intimidation, she'd try something else. By the time the sun began to set that day, my mailbox had already been stuffed with a folded paper and official HOA violation notice. The offense: unauthorized occupancy and failure to notify the Millstone Grove Homeowners Association prior to moving. I laughed out loud. Was she serious? I had just moved in, barely unpacked, and this woman was already playing the fine and threaten. Game. The notice warned of a $250 penalty if I didn't attend a compliance hearing at the clubhouse the following week. I tossed it in the trash and decided then and there I wasn't going to let some power-drunk neighbor with a clipboard ruin my fresh start. But that was only the beginning. The next morning, a white SUV with the HOA logo parked across the street for over an hour. A man inside took photos of my truck, my front porch, even the pile of boxes stacked beside the barn. When I waved at him, he drove off. A few hours later, an email landed in my inbox, another notice from the HOA claiming I was operating a commercial business on residential property and citing vehicle obstruction. They even took issue with the antique tractor I'd brought from my grandfather's farm, calling it an eyesore. Inconsistent with community aesthetics? It was absurd, but it didn't stop. The next day, a neighbor approached me. Nice guy. Older name was Jim. He leaned in and said, "You should watch your back. Karen doesn't like being embarrassed. You embarrassed her in front of the sheriff?" I thanked him, but inside, I was already planning my next steps. I wasn't about to play defense. I was going to find out exactly what the HOA was allowed to do, what they were not, and whether my ranch bought independently from the development was even legally under their jurisdiction. Spent hours reading the HOA bylaws, combing county plat maps, and researching property records. And that's when I found it. The boundary line for Millstone Grove ended about 300 feet before my front porch. The previous owners had opted out of HOA services 20 years ago during the subdivision restructure, meaning Karen and her little army had absolutely zero authority over my land. None. Not legally, not administratively, not financially. But they didn't know that yet, and I wasn't about to tell them. Not just yet, because I had a better idea. One that would show Karen exactly how powerless she really was. She thought calling the police would scare me. She thought waving rules in my face would send me packing. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. I was raised on a ranch, taught to stand my ground, to fight when something mattered, and to never let a bully go unchallenged. So if Karen wanted a war, she was about to get one, and I was going to win it with facts, law, and unshakable proof. But first, I needed to bait the trap just a little more. If you've ever dealt with a Karen like this, someone who thinks rules only apply when she enforces them, then you know how important it is to fight back with truth and evidence. Subscribe to Sham Stories right now, because the moment I flipped this HOA on its head was just the beginning, and you won't believe how far Karen went once she realized she didn't have the power she thought she did. The next few days after the police incident felt like a strange mix of eerie calm and underlying tension. The kind that settles in just before a storm tears through a valley. And I knew deep down that Karen wasn't finished, not by a long shot. I kept to myself mostly, unloading the rest of my boxes, getting the barn cleaned out, and putting some order to the tools and furniture I'd hauled from my old house. But all the while, I could feel eyes on my windows lifting ever so slightly. As I walked past, slow-driving cars lingering longer than normal, and people whispering from their porches like I was some kind of outlaw who had taken up residence in their pristine little gated paradise. Then on the third morning it happened again. This time, I was repairing a broken section of my wooden fence along the east end of the property when two HOA board members showed up in fluorescent vests, clipboards in hand. Sunglasses on, and Karen striding behind them like a general with troops in tow. They didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves. They walked straight up to the edge of the yard like they owned it and started pointing at things, whispering among themselves. I stood up slowly, put down my hammer, and calmly walked over. "Can I help you?" I asked, already knowing the answer. One of the board members, a pudgy man with a deep sunburn and a smug tone, spoke first. "We're here to assess your property. For violations, this isn't a registered fence material. That tractor over there may be leaking fluids. And I count 5 infractions just from the front-facing elevation." "Interesting," I said, keeping my tone measured. "But none of this land falls under your HOA. You can go ahead and check your own property maps if you'd like." Karen pushed forward then, lips tight, voice cold. "We've received numerous complaints about noise, unsightly construction, debris, and unauthorized vehicle storage. You've ignored every citation we've issued, Mr. Prescott. That's a clear violation of HOA code." "You mean those laughable notices you stuffed into my mailbox?" I said, holding back a smirk. Those would matter if your authority reached this property. It doesn't, but I'll play along. Show me your documentation, Karen hesitated. The man beside her shuffled uncomfortably, flipping through a folder filled with printed aerial photos and vague bullet points. I leaned in, scanning it quickly. These are stock Google Earth images. This isn't legal documentation. I pulled out a manila envelope I had tucked into my belt loop, the one containing all my county-verified documents, and opened it to the page showing the recorded plat map with signatures. You see this line? That's your boundary. This, I pointed to the shaded portion, is me. Outside your reach? Kieran didn't even look. We'll see about that, she snapped. Ow. You think this changes anything? You're disrupting the community. You're bringing down property values. You've become a spectacle, and this is a family neighborhood. I laughed then, not out of mockery, but genuine disbelief. Lady, I haven't even fired up the grill yet. You haven't? Seen anything disruptive? She stormed off, shouting back over her shoulder. Don't say I didn't give you a chance to cooperate. That night, I started getting strange calls. Block numbers, hang-ups, a few late-night knocks on the door with no one there. When I opened it, I knew Karen was behind it, trying to rattle me. But I wasn't rattled. I was focused. I had a plan. The next morning, I went down to the county zoning office and requested every document easement, annexation record for Millstone Grove and the surrounding parcels, including mine. I even asked the clerk, an older man named Roger who'd lived in the county for 4 decades, if he'd ever heard of the HOA trying to overreach their boundaries. Karen again? He asked, without missing a beat. I nodded, and he sighed. That woman's been trying to redraw maps with her mouth since she moved in. Don't let her push you. You've got every legal right to tell her to pound sand. Armed with everything I needed, I returned home and posted a large laminated sign on the edge of my property that read, "Private property, not subject to HOA jurisdiction. Trespassers will be reported." It was big, bold, and impossible to miss. 2 hours later, Karen was back. But this time, she wasn't alone. A county inspector followed behind her, clipboard in hand. She waved at me like a pageant queen, smug as ever. "Good morning, Mr. Prescott," she said sweetly. "Just wanted to introduce you to Mr. Havers from County Code Enforcement. We've had some concerns about your barn structure and whether it complies with fire regulations. That barn's been standing for 50 years, I said, and it hasn't been modified since I moved in." The inspector glanced over his paperwork. "Technically, there's nothing here that's actionable. Your property's zoned correctly. No open flame, no exposed wires, no new construction. This looks fine to me." Karen's smile faded. She turned to him sharply. "What about the fence? And the vehicles?" "Not under my jurisdiction," he said plainly. Certainly not. The HOAS. He turned to me and added, "Sorry to waste your time, sir. Have a good day." I watched Karen's jaw tighten so hard I thought it might snap. She didn't say a word this time, just turned and walked briskly back to her car. But she wasn't. Giving up the next week, she filed a noise complaint with the county, claiming I had been operating machinery after hours. Then a littering complaint, alleging I was dumping construction debris on a shared road. Then she tried contacting the fire department to report a visible fire hazard on the property my grill. Each time someone would show up, check things out, and leave without issue. I made sure to remain calm, respectful, and professional. With every official that came out, knowing full well Karen was hoping I'd snap, lose my temper, and give her ammo. But I didn't. I documented everything. Every notice, every visit, every neighbor who mentioned Karen's little campaign. I even installed cameras at the front gate and driveway, not just for protection, but so I could collect undeniable proof if she tried anything again. One evening, just before dusk, I caught her walking along the outer edge of my property with a flashlight, pointing at things and talking into a voice recorder. That's when I knew it was time to take it up a notch. I called a friend of mine, a local journalist named Rachel, who ran a small but respected blog that covered community affairs and public interest stories. I told her everything, every false report, every trespass, every abuse of power Karen had used under the HOA banner. Rachel was fascinated and agreed to run a story after doing some independent verification. Over the next week, she interviewed me, talked to neighbors, pulled public documents, and put it all together in a scathing expose titled HOA or Harassment. One man's fight against overreach in Millstone Grove. When it went live, it spread like wildfire through the community Facebook group, the town forum, and even got picked up by the local news station. Neighbors who had remained neutral suddenly began reaching out. Some with apologies, others with their own stories of Karen's bullying behavior. It was like a curtain had been pulled back, and people finally saw what she truly was: not a protector of property values, but a petty dictator who thrived on fear and control. Karen tried to fight back, releasing a formal HOA statement accusing me of defamation, destabilizing community harmony, and endangering the integrity of neighborhood order. But no one bought it. Her credibility had been shredded. Still, I knew Karen wouldn't go down without a final swing. And I was right, because just a few days later, she filed a formal lawsuit against me, claiming I had illegally rejected the authority of a governing association and endangered community standards. It was the dumbest, most desperate move she could have made. And it was exactly what I'd been waiting for. By the time the lawsuit officially landed on my doorstep, I wasn't even surprised I'd been expecting it. It's like a thunderstorm you watch slowly crawling across the horizon, darkening everything in its path with predictable fury. The envelope was thick, stamped with Karen's HOA letterhead, as if that added any legitimacy to the nonsense inside. The suit alleged that I had willfully violated Millstone Grove HOA regulations, damaged neighborhood unity, and defamed their governing authority through slander and public misinformation. I read the claims twice, almost in disbelief at how brazenly Karen had twisted the facts. She cited my refusal to attend the fake HOA compliance meeting, my antagonistic signage, and even included screenshots of the article Rachel had published, claiming it had caused reputational harm to the HOA board. I couldn't help but laugh. Karen had just fired the final shot in a war she had no business starting. And now she had walked herself straight into a legal trap I was more than ready for. I immediately contacted my attorney, David Kingsley, a quiet, sharp-witted guy who had handled real estate cases for nearly 2 decades and wasn't easily intimidated. I handed him the lawsuit, the plat maps, the court-confirmed property lines, every notice and citation Karen had sent, along with the sheriff's report from the day she first called the cops on me. David leaned back in his chair, scanned everything carefully, then said, "This isn't just overreach. It's harassment. If the court sees it that way, we're not only going to win, we're going to bury her case." So we filed our response, not just denying her claims, but countersuing for harassment, defamation, emotional distress, and abusive process. The case quickly picked up steam. The court date was set for 6 weeks out, and word spread fast through the community. Suddenly, the HOA board was in a panic. Half of them started distancing themselves from Karen publicly, claiming they had no idea she was acting so aggressively and that they'd never supported legal action against a private property owner, but it was too late. Their names were on the board, and the lawsuit had been filed under the HOA's name. Meanwhile, Karen doubled down, sending new emails and even handwritten letters to my mailbox, insisting she was protecting the community and that I was undermining everything good about Millstone Grove. She started walking her dog past my ranch 4 times a day, always pausing in front of my camera, sometimes staring straight into the lens with that smug, unrepentant expression that made my blood boil. She was unraveling, but too prideful to back down. As the court date neared, more neighbors came forward with stories about Karen'sm, about fines for toys left in yards, others about threats of foreclosure over unpaid dues, even one elderly couple who admitted they sold their house early just to get away from her constant surveillance and interference. Rachel published a follow-up piece with anonymous testimonials. This time, the local news station aired a segment highlighting abuse of power in homeowners associations. Karen's name wasn't mentioned directly, but everyone knew. She was the face of everything wrong with neighborhood governance, and her power was collapsing brick by brick. When the day of the court hearing finally arrived, walked into the county courthouse wearing jeans and a button-down shirt, Calm and collected, with David beside me and a thick binder of irrefutable evidence in hand. Karen arrived 20 minutes late, dressed like she was auditioning for a role as a corporate tyrant, holding a stack of crumpled papers and flanked by a lawyer who looked like he regretted taking the case the moment he stepped inside. The judge, an older woman with no patience for theatrics, wasted no time. She let Karen's attorney speak first, and he droned on about community values, harmony, structure, and the disruption caused by my refusal to conform to HOA guidelines. But the judge stopped him quickly. "Show me where in your bylaws this property falls under your governance." He fumbled with a poorly highlighted map. "We believe there's a boundary dispute. Belief is not evidence," the judge snapped. "You're here making legal claims against a man who holds a clean title outside your jurisdiction. Prove otherwise, or this case is over before it starts." Karen's lawyer glanced nervously at her, then admitted, We don't have confirmed legal jurisdiction over the property." And just like that, the room shifted. The judge turned to us. David stood and calmly presented everything: the plat map, the original property deed, zoning records, the previous owners, exemption from HOA membership, and even the harassment timeline with video clips, email screenshots, and Karen's angry HOA letters. When David played the video of Karen telling me "you don't belong here" while waving her phone as she called the police, the judge leaned back in her chair and sighed audibly. "I've seen enough," she said. "Ms. Prescott, this court confirms that your property lies outside the governance of Millstone Grove HOA. All claims made against you are dismissed. Furthermore, based on the evidence of sustained harassment and bad faith legal action, I am awarding you damages of $25,000 and referring the matter to the county for investigation into HOA abuse." Karen's mouth fell open, and for once she didn't speak. Not a word. She simply sat there, stunned, as the gavel came down and the courtroom emptied. But the fallout didn't end there. The next week, an emergency HOA meeting was called without Karen. The remaining board members voted unanimously to remove her from her position as president, strip her of all authority, and issue a formal apology to me, published in the neighborhood newsletter and emailed to every resident. But it didn't stop her neighbors from turning on her too. One by one, people began talking. Social events she used to dominate no longer welcomed her. A petition started circulating to permanently dissolve the HOA altogether. Property values didn't drop as she had warned they would. If I stead anything, they went up, thanks to the national attention from the article and the community's fresh start. Karen, now a pariah in her own neighborhood, retreated inside her house. Curtains drawn, blinds shut, barely stepping outside except to collect mail. But I knew it wasn't over yet, not completely. She'd lost the legal battle. She'd lost her status. But she still had one thing left to lose, and I intended to make sure she did. Because what Karen didn't know was that the investigation, sparked by the judge's referral, had uncovered even more than harassment: financial mismanagement, unauthorized use of HOA funds, falsified violations and fines, and soon the entire structure she built was about to collapse under the weight of her lies. Once the judge's referral kicked off a formal investigation into the Millstone Grove HOA's financial activity, the unraveling of Karen's entire empire began in earnest. Not with dramatic arrests or shouting matches, but with a quiet knock on doors, calls to the county auditor's office, and a steady drip of revelations that painted a damning picture of the toxic little regime she had built over the years. It started with the county's forensic audit team, a group of stern-faced professionals with clipboards and laptops who arrived at the HOA's office located inside the same community clubhouse Karen had once lorded over like a queen with a crown of bylaws. What they found there stunned even the auditors: disorganized records, missing invoices, undocumented fees, and stacks of violation notices with no supporting evidence or due process trail. It quickly became clear that Karen had not only exaggerated her authority but had weaponized it, using fines and rule citations as a personal power trip against anyone who questioned her. Many of those violations had never been discussed with the board, and several neighbors came forward to say they had paid fines directly to Karen herself in cash, without ever receiving receipts. What was once just a rumor about her pocketing money was now becoming a legitimate allegation of embezzlement. Word spread fast. Neighbors who had once bowed to Karen's authority now came out of hiding, sharing their stories. One woman, Linda, widowed schoolteacher who'd lived on Grove Drive for nearly 15 years, revealed she had been fined over $1,000 in a single summer for having her porch light on too late and storing bicycles in visible areas. When she had asked to appeal the citations, Karen had reportedly threatened to place a lien on her house. Another resident, Greg, said he had been billed twice for HOA dues by mail and once in person, both times under the claim of late penalties. Even though he had paid on time, he never saw the money reflected on his HOA account. All of this was now being compiled into a formal report by the auditor's office, and I was asked to submit my own documentation, including the notices Karen had sent me, the video footage of her confrontations, and the legal findings from the court case she had lost. I handed it all over gladly. Meanwhile, Karen remained holed up inside her house, curtains drawn, refusing to speak to anyone. Rumors swirled about her, trying to rally support from the remaining board members, but her influence had evaporated. Even the most loyal residents had turned against her now, realizing they had been fooled by someone who had wielded fear as a tool for far too long. And then came the first official blow. The HOA bank account was frozen, pending investigation. Without funds, the community maintenance services halted. The lawn crews stopped showing up. Trash pickup was delayed. The once perfect landscaping at the clubhouse began to wither. Karen had always claimed the HOA kept the neighborhood clean and presentable. Now, with her rain disabled, the cracks she had worked so hard to cover with control began to show. But the real storm hit 2 weeks later when the county filed formal charges against her: fraud, misappropriation of community funds, and harassment. The charges were announced in a brief press conference held outside the county office, and within minutes, every news station in the region picked it up. The headline was brutal: local HOA president charged with fraud, years of community abuse uncovered. Karen was served papers on her doorstep, and cameras captured her shoving the documents back at the officer, shouting that she was the victim of a smear campaign. It didn't matter. The damage was done. She was removed permanently from her role, her name struck from all HOA records. And the county placed the entire association under temporary administrative oversight while a decision was made about its future. I didn't celebrate it. I knew Karen still had her pride, and people like her don't let go quietly. True to form, just days after being charged, she filed a bizarre lawsuit accusing me of colluding with auditors to falsify documents and orchestrating a public humiliation campaign. It was dismissed immediately by the court as frivolous, and this time the judge warned that any further legal action from her could result in sanctions. But her obsession with blaming me didn't stop there. She began posting online long rants on obscure neighborhood forums and social media platforms, claiming she was being persecuted, comparing herself to a whistleblower, and even hinting that I had bribed the county to steal her power. The posts were unhinged, delusional, and painfully public. One even showed a blurry photo of me unloading a bag of soil with the caption, "Suspicious activities still happening, proof coming soon." It would have been funny if it weren't so sad. The final blow to her credibility came from inside the very walls of her home. Her own niece, who had been staying with her temporarily, came forward to the press, and the county investigator admitted that Karen had been keeping boxes of old HOA documents in the garage, some of which contained hand-altered numbers, blacked-out sections, and sticky notes detailing which residents should be pressured. Her niece even shared an audio recording where Karen talked about ruining Prescott's life before he ruins mine. The county added tampering with public records and intent to defraud to the growing list of charges. At that point, Karen's defense crumbled. Her lawyer withdrew from representation. Her house, once immaculately kept, now sat with a neglected lawn, newspapers piling at the porch. No one came to visit. Children whispered her name when they walked by. "That's where the crazy HOA lady lives," one kid said. I watched it all from my porch with quiet satisfaction, not because I enjoyed her suffering, but because it finally felt like justice was working. And still, I hadn't taken a single step beyond what was legal, factual, and measured. I didn't scream. I didn't retaliate. I simply stood my ground, documented the truth, and let the system catch up to her lies. And as the HOA began collapsing under the weight of Karen's abuse, something unexpected began to happen in the neighborhood. People started talking again without fear. One Saturday, I hosted a bonfire on the backside of the ranch and invited a few of the families who had spoken up. Nearly 30 people showed up, bringing snacks, drinks, folding chairs, and stories. Real stories. Stories about how they had felt silenced for years, how they had been too afraid to speak out, how Karen had used her title to shame, threaten, and divide the community. But that night, laughter replaced fear. A sense of unity bloomed in a place where control had once ruled. The same community that once watched me with suspicion now shook my hand, patted my back, and thanked me for not backing down. But there was one last thing I needed to do. A neighbor named Sheila, one of the few remaining board members who had refused to go along with Karen's tyranny, approached me privately and said, "Tyler, there's a vote coming up to dissolve the HOA completely. We're short a few votes, but if we get them, this whole thing can finally end." I looked out across the hills of my ranch, then back at the clubhouse Karen had once claimed as her kingdom. "Count me in," I said. "Let's end it for good." Drafted a petition, organized a town hall, and within days, we had the numbers. The vote was set. The HOA's fate would be decided. Karen would finally lose the last remnants of her crumbling power. The day of the final vote to dissolve the Millstone Grove HOA arrived beneath a sky so blue and cloudless it almost felt staged, as if the heavens themselves had decided to clear away every trace of gloom just for this moment, this reckoning, that had been building for years. Long before I ever moved into my ranch and had the audacity to park my truck on my own land without Karen's permission. By the time I walked into the clubhouse, the same clubhouse Karen once ruled like a monarch, a crowd had already gathered. And for the first time since all of this began, I didn't feel like an outsider. I nodded at familiar faces, shook hands with neighbors who once avoided me, and even saw a few of them bring their kids. A clear sign that the fear Karen once instilled in this community had finally evaporated. There were folding chairs, coffee urns, a table with clipboards and ballots, and a small podium at the front where Sheila stood holding the microphone. She gave a short, firm speech explaining how the HOA, once intended to serve the community, had instead been weaponized by one woman's hunger for control, and that now was the time to put that chapter behind us. People clapped, people cheered, and then the vote began. One by one, residents stepped forward, signed their names, and dropped their ballots into the locked box. Karen wasn't there. Her house sat dark and cold a block away, its blinds still drawn, mailbox stuffed with unopened notices, her reign reduced to silence and dust. As the final ballots were counted, a hush fell over the room. Sheila stood back up, glanced at the numbers, and then looked out at us all. "It's done," she said, tears in her eyes. By a vote of 84-3, the Millstone Grove Homeowners Association is hereby dissolved. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in a kind of peaceful roar, the sound of collective relief, of people reclaiming their voice after years of being silenced. Neighbors hugged each other, a few cried, kids laughed and ran through the aisles. It was the most human, unguarded moment this community had seen in years, and I stood there in the center of it all, knowing that somehow, despite being the one who had been treated like a criminal, like a trespasser, I had helped them find their courage again. But even as the HOA fell away, the consequences for Karen weren't done. The county's case against her proceeded, and she was eventually indicted on multiple counts, including mail fraud, embezzlement, and harassment. She was fined heavily, ordered to repay every cent she had taken from residents under false pretenses, and sentenced to 18 months of probation, along with 600 hours of community service. Ironically, meant that she was now the one pulling weeds, repainting fences, and maintaining the very roads she used to walk while issuing threats. A few people took pictures when they saw her picking up trash in a neon vest, her once perfect hair tied up in a messy bun, her posture no longer confident but sunken, like a balloon slowly leaking its last breath. She avoided eye contact, but I knew she saw me when I passed her once outside the general store. I didn't speak. I didn't gloat. I just nodded because nothing I could say would carry more weight than what reality had already handed her. But even with Karen's downfall complete and the HOA dismantled, I knew the bigger story wasn't about her, it was about all of us. About what happens when power goes unchecked. About what a community can endure and how it can heal. I turned my attention back to the ranch. The land felt different now, lighter. I rebuilt the broken fence in peace, planted new apple trees along the back slope, finally unpacked the last box in my new home, free from the looming threat of bogus fines or HOA nonsense. People began to stop by, often not to complain or criticize, but to talk, to offer help, to say thank you. One older man who had lived in the area for over 30 years brought me a hand-carved welcome sign that read, Prescott Ranch, 2024. It's still nailed to the fence post by the driveway. And every time I see it, I'm reminded of the battle it took to earn the right to feel at home. Months passed, and with each one, the neighborhood became more vibrant. Without the fear of Karen's interference, people painted their homes in the colors they loved, planted gardens where HOA rules once forbade them, and children played freely again. It felt like breathing after years of suffocation. Even the clubhouse, no longer under HOA control, was turned into a shared community space, open for book clubs, game nights, cookouts, and birthday parties. I hosted a ranch tour for the local kids, let them meet the goats and learn how to ride safely. The laughter echoing across the field was the kind of sound that washed away even the darkest memory. But for all the peace and new beginnings, I kept every document, every video clip, every letter Karen ever sent. Not because I feared she'd return to power, but because stories like this don't just belong in a file drawer, they need to be shared, to warn others, to inspire action when someone like her tries to do it again somewhere else. That's why I reached out to Sham Stories to tell the full truth of how one HOA president tried to use fear, lies, and legal threats to destroy an innocent man, and how that man stood his ground, fought with facts, and helped free an entire neighborhood from a tyrant hiding behind rules. If you've ever faced someone like Karen or are dealing with one now, know this. You are not powerless. You are not crazy. You are not alone. Speak up. Document everything. Know your rights. And when the moment comes, stand your ground. Because justice may be slow, but it is real. My ranch is quiet now. The sun rises over the hills, the chickens cluck at dawn, and the wind carries nothing but the scent of fresh soil and a life rebuilt. Karen's reign is over, her lies exposed, her fear-driven empire crumbled to dust. And this land, this home, this freedom it's mine, earned, protected, and never again up for debate. If this story reminded you of something you've faced, or someone you know has battled a similar injustice, don't let their story go untold. Subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, where the truth gets a voice, where stories like mine don't get buried, and where we stand up to the Karens of the world, one powerful story at a time.